But our scripture today is found in the book of Acts. We're continuing on. We're trying to get a chapter in a week. Acts chapter 12. We're going to read a lengthy bit of Acts chapter 12 today. The beginning part of Acts, you can almost split Acts up into a couple of sections, two sections. And the beginning part is really the establishment of the early church and the workings, and the second half, which will start next week, really is about the missionary journeys and the gospel going out. And so today's is kind of a closure on that beginning part. If you remember, persecution has been on the rise, especially after Stephen was killed. People started to see, hey, people kind of enjoy it when we're mean to these Christian people, so let's be more mean. And that's kind of where we are in Acts chapter 12. We're going to read verses 1 through 19. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after this Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. The night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. Then the angel said to him, "Put on your clothes and sandals." And Peter did so. "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me," the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea that what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. They passed the first and second guards and came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through it. When they had walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything that Jewish people were anticipating." When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed she ran back without opening it and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." "You're out of your mind," they told her. When she kept insisting that it was so, they said, "It must be his angel." But Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. "Tell James and the brothers about this," he said, and then he left for another place. In the morning there was no small commotion among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. After Herod had a thorough search made for him and did not find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed. So, yeah, I read a lot more than the 10 verses that they tell us we're supposed to read, but that's all one chunk, and if you really split it up, you miss parts. And actually, the last part is Herod's death, so that kind of plays into this too, but we don't need to read all of that. But it starts out, Herod is persecuting the church. One of the things, to give you some historical context, this Herod was put in place in AD 41. So he's the Herod after Jesus was killed, not the same guy, and not the same Herod that was there for Jesus' birth either. So he is put in Palestine. He's kind of kicked out of Rome. And what's the word when he's confined to Palestine? He's exiled to this area. But he's given charge of Judea, and Jerusalem is in Judea. And he's kicked out because, well, he said some things about Caesar that was not so nice, and so Caesar, instead of killing him, exiled him. And people didn't like him. They didn't like him, and so he's doing whatever he can to get his political likings, to get the people to like him, which is why he is persecuting the church. He has no feelings whatsoever for the church, against the church, other than, hey, this gets me political gain, sort of a thing. Right? Politicians have been doing it all the way back then. It's forever, right? And so he's persecuting them, and he kills James. The James he kills, so we get our people correct. This James is James, the brother of John, James, the son of Zebedee, James, one of the three disciples that whenever Jesus went off and took a few, they were the three, Peter, James, and John. This is that James that he has killed by the sword. All right, so James is really the first of the apostles to be killed. So Stephen was the first martyr. James is now the first apostle, first one of those leaders. Later on, we heard that Peter said, go tell James to differentiate. The first James is James, the brother of John. The second James is James, the brother of Jesus. Okay? And James, the brother of Jesus, actually becomes the head of the church in Jerusalem. He becomes the chief elder there, the pastor of that church. And which is why Peter says, go tell James, because he's kind of the guy in charge, sort of a thing. So this is the context of what happens. And so Peter is arrested, and he's going to be put to death. The 4 squads of 4 soldiers are on a rotation so that nobody has to fall asleep, so that there's no excuse for not being able to see your guard or see your case, because they really want to stop Peter from being able to escape. They don't want people to come in and take him out, because remember, there's this rumor that the disciples stole the body of Christ, and so if there's this big movement, we don't want their leaders to be taken, right? That's the political mindset. That's what's going on. So these guards that are watching him, they're not sleeping. They're not, we've been working a 12-hour day and we're tired kind of guards. No, they're watching him. And if you notice in verse 19, the punishment for losing him was their death. And this was not a special case, you lost this big guy, so we're going to... No, this was just how it worked. If the guard lost their prisoner, the guard took on the punishment of the prisoner. All right, and one of the reasons why it's important to note that, why it's important to realize that, is because, again, either the guards had to be very faithful believers, all 16 of them kind of a thing, or at least all 4 who were working at that time, or something miraculous had to have happened. All right, so this little detail kind of points to, God was in charge. God was involved. Because there are people who will go through and say, well, let's explain this without a supernatural explanation. And they do that with the Bible. This is what it really was taught. This is what really happened. Well, no, the Bible kind of points out this was a supernatural occurrence. And if you really thought through as a human being, no human being who didn't really believe and had all 4 guys believing too would be willing to put themselves to... It's just not that kind of a story. God is supernatural and is involved in the world. And for me, I think that's important for us to remember, because it's easy to think, well, yes, we pray and God's out there, but, I read the book Where the Red Ferns Grow when I was a young kid, and the kid was taught, you pray like it's all up to God and you act like it's all up to you, right? And the mindset really is that you're praying, but you're actually doing the work. Just like we were talking about in the children's message, right? You did all the studying and you prayed to pass the test, but I will tell you I got through high school without studying a single thing. I passed all my tests with flying colors. I prayed for every test. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew God answers prayer, right? And so this supernatural thing happens. God takes Peter out of the prison. I don't remember where I was going with that. But old age is setting in too quickly. Everybody's like, you're not old. It's okay. Senility starts at the age of 19, so it starts showing signs. So, but anyway, the supernatural thing happens. Peter is released from prison. Before this happens, the church is praying. And I find it interesting, too, that the church, when he shows up, they're like, so it's not just us. If you ever felt that way, that sometimes I worry that God doesn't. It's not. It's universal. Even back then, when they saw, these are the people who walked with Jesus. They saw the miracles. They still, their prayers have been answered. No, that can't be. It can't be because of that, right? This is the children's message, so I shouldn't be rehashing it, but it was a good children's message. So, one of the things they say in their "it can't be," this is another giving you some context, is they say it must be his angel. It was the common belief of the Jewish people at that time that everybody had a guardian angel, and you hear these things from time to time. There's no biblical evidence that everybody has a guardian angel. But in their belief, the guardian angel looked and sounded just like you, sort of a thing. So that's where that comes from. But what I really wanted to look at in this passage is that deliverance that Peter receives. Okay, Peter is there in prison. He's chained to the guards, and the angel comes in. The guards don't seem to do anything, so they seem to be knocked unconscious when the angel appears. And the chains fall off of Peter. And at that point, he is able to leave. And I was thinking about this and how it applies to our lives. And I was thinking, when Jesus comes into our hearts, the chains in our lives, they fall off. The things that stop us from doing what God has called us to do, they're gone. They no longer have power over us. The manacles are not there. God has delivered us from this. And I don't know what it is in your life that may keep you from doing whatever it is that God's called you to do. But the reality is, it doesn't have the power to stop you if you don't let it. We have a tendency as human beings, when the chains fall off, we pick them up and we try to put them back on. Because we know what it's like to be chained, and that we feel comfortable there, we feel safe there. And the first thing to note is, when the chains fall off, let them off. Get rid of them. I don't know if it's fear of people that stop us from doing what God's called us to do. If it's we're too busy. That one seems to be a big one for a lot of people. Is I'm just too busy to do what, for a lot of young people, it's video games. Daniel's not here. He likes to play a lot of video games. I liked to play a lot of video games when I was a young person. We don't have to hold it. Is it our sin? Is it our sin that's holding us back? We don't have to keep it. In fact, we're supposed to let it go, to set it aside. I remember when I was called into the ministry when I was younger, I said, God, you can't call me into the ministry. I don't read. Because, it's hard to read. He said, I don't care. You're coming into the ministry. Well, I'm learning how to read. I read an awful lot now, just not everything that I should be reading, right? Reading To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. It's an interesting story. It's for class. I'm learning to read, right? Seminary had us reading a lot of things too. Paul gave me half of his library. It's a lot of good stuff to read. Some really deep thinkers. I had to let that go. I had to say, God, I'll go into the ministry. I had to drop the chains that were stopping me from doing what I was called to do. And we're not all called to be pastors. We're not all called to be missionaries. But we are called to do something. And I found in my life that almost always we all have some chains that we're holding on to and going, nope, I can't do it because of. And if we really thought through our lives, we might find those chains. And the reality is that when God came in, he said, no, there are no more chains on you. You don't need them. They aren't going to hold you down. And that really is the bulk of chapter 12 here, is that the gospel isn't going to be chained. God's servants aren't going to be chained. They aren't going to be stopped from getting that message out. So Herod, who is persecuting, Herod who chains them up, and the end of the story, Herod is willing to accept worship and God kills Herod. See, Herod tried to kill God's people and God killed Herod instead. Because the gospel isn't going to be stopped. We don't need to keep the chains on us anymore. And so when the chains fall off, let them fall off. Something else had to happen too. Peter had to wake up. The reality is, we have to wake up. And I like the way they put it in all of the English translations I've read. The angel either hits him or strikes him on the side. So you don't get this picture of the gentle, when you go in to wake up your children in the morning, it's time to get up. No, it's when your sibling comes in to wake you up and whacks you on the side. Get up! Come on! I don't know what it takes to wake us up, right? In my household, that's just called sleeping, right? Just getting whacked on the side. The dog does it to me all the time. Sarah's like, well, I don't hit you anymore. No, but the dog does. Get up, the angel says. We have to wake up. I've heard several people say 2020 is the wake-up call. All these bad things that are happening in the world is supposed to be a wake-up call for us to get out and do what God's called us to do. To share the gospel. Christians, we need to wake up. Our eyes need to be open, our hearts need to be open, and we need to wake up. To the moving of the Spirit. So the angel wakes him up, and it's a sharp wake up. Whatever it takes. When I was a camp counselor, I had one kid, he wouldn't get up. We took his bed, we carried it outside, and we dumped it. I was 17 at the time. Probably not the wisest thing to do, and I don't recommend it to any new counselors, but it got him out of bed. We need our beds dumped. We need to wake up. The next thing the angel says is to put on your shoes. In the NIV, it says, put on your, get up, put on your clothing, sandals. In the New King James, it actually leaves off the clothes part. Put on your sandals. Put on your shoes. Get ready to be able to move. This took me over to Ephesians, where it talks about the full armor of God and its feet shod with the preparation of the gospel. All that studying I didn't do back in high school. All that reading I didn't do. I wasn't prepared to read like I needed to be able to read, right? It was preparing us. Daniel hates math. I keep telling him, Daniel, you're doing this math to prepare you to be out in the real world. Now that he's playing some video games with me, I'm like, see how the math that you refuse to do is necessary even for these video games you like to play. We need to be prepared, and we get prepared by studying it. By putting it in our minds, in our hearts. Thy truth have I hid in my heart, right? I was in class this week, and I'm taking the American Literature class that I withdrew from because it was too late at night one day a week last year. I'm taking it again, and we were reading a sermon by John Winthrop, and the teacher is like, well, this sermon is really John Winthrop trying to tell the poor people to stay poor and to stay in their class place. And I shaking my head going, no, it's not. And I said to Sarah, I couldn't argue with my teacher about it because I didn't want to be mean and I didn't want to interrupt her. But if John Winthrop was going to preach on that, he would have used, and Sarah said, he would have used this text. I said, exactly, that's exactly what I'm thinking. But my teacher doesn't have enough biblical knowledge to know that. Oh, there's better text if that's what he was aiming at. What John Winthrop was actually preaching about was wealthy people take care of the poor. And he used a lot of biblical examples about how if you are given blessed by God, that you should be taking care of those less fortunate than yourselves. Right? Because John Winthrop had the Bible very well memorized. He knew it. He had studied it. In fact, when you look at the early Americans, the Pilgrims and those guys who came over, they quote Scripture left and right. Why? Because they've been studying it. They've been preparing to use it in their life, and not just the pastors. Not just it was just the way Christians were at that time. They were prepared for the work they were called to do. They were ready to go. They were ready to move. So the angel says, get up. Your chains are off, so let's go. Get your shoes on. Put on your cloak. Get the rest of it on too. Paul says put on the whole armor. It's not just about just your shoes. You got to have it all on. We got to meet the world fully dressed, fully aware. They can't catch us with our pants down kind of a thing. We need to be ready at any moment to do the work that God's called us to do. And so Peter is released from prison. He goes, he meets with John Mark and the group there. And the gospel goes out from there. And John Mark is the guy who wrote the book of Mark. Many believe that John Mark was Peter's secretary, that they had that kind of relationship. He's going to come up more and more. But from chapter 13 out, it's more about the gospel going out. Because, what happens in these walls is important, but it's never supposed to stay in these walls. It's always supposed to go out. I remember as a kid, a young kid, everybody had this idea that when you came into the church, you're supposed to be on your best behaviors. And my church organist looked at us and said, you should behave no differently in church than you do outside of church. Because you're always representing God. You're always at the work. And the reality is that what we do in here is supposed to go out into the world. A major reason for the persecution was to send it out because they were staying in Jerusalem too long. They weren't spreading the gospel. And so with 12, the answer is nothing is going to stop the spread. Except for us not waking up. Except for us not being prepared. Except for us not doing our job. Because God has, for some reason, in His infinite wisdom, chosen us to be His mouthpiece, to be His hands, to be His feet. He's chosen us to minister to the world so that those who don't know Him can come to know Him. Those who do know Him can come to know Him better. So it's time that we set down our chains, that we wake up, that we get prepared, and that we get fully dressed, so that we may do the work that God calls us to do. Will you bow with me in prayer?